Welcome to the Sykes & Company PA video blog.
Before you begin any process here with a startup, you got to have a federal ID number. And you don't want to get a federal ID number until you decide exactly how the entity should be set up. So we typically will suggest our go-to entity being an LLC, and we typically make an S election. So once the LLC operating agreement is formed, we can get a federal ID number. And Bonnie, once the pharmacist gets the federal ID number, we have that LLC set up and have the operating agreement, what typically do we see as the next steps there?
Well, there's going to normally be various setup items that need to be taken care of within the particular state, depending on what state that's in. Obviously, this is kind of where it's important to have someone, a CPA, and especially a CPA maybe that works with pharmacy, that can help in this process, because a lot of that information is really important to make sure that is done correctly from the very beginning. And keeping in mind, when you do, the second that you set up a federal ID number, even if your pharmacy doesn't open for a couple of years, there is going to be tax returns and that sort of thing that are going to be due immediately for that particular year. So it's just really important to keep that in mind, that even if no business has taken place, there will be tax returns that are due.
That's correct. And once that entity is set up and that federal ID number has been procured, and this is something that can be procured by somebody who's familiar with this in about 10 minutes electronically with the IRS, then we suggest you set up a bank account for that entity, and you start to run all your transactions, preliminary startup costs, due diligence costs, any and all costs that you have associated with the startup entity through there. So even if you have to put money in it yourself, as either as a member loan or as permanent equity, whatever the case may be, the information and data can be tracked for tax purposes. Because as Bonnie mentioned, clearly a tax return is going to be due, even if you have one transaction in it for the year, if you've made an S election. And if you don't file a return, and you say, I don't have to file a return because I haven't started operations, you're probably under false premise there, and could be subject to some pretty stiff IRS penalties, depending on how many S corporation shareholders that you have. So also, as Bonnie mentioned a moment ago, checking with your board of pharmacy in your state to see what the requirements are. Once you have that in place, you've got your federal ID number. You typically will have to find out what the DEA requirements are in your states. There are different requirements in each state about what takes place. And as you move forward, you typically get your MPI, your CPA.CITP numbers. You've got those squared away. And then as you begin to talk with your wholesalers and buying groups, you select who you're going with there. And to a great degree, that has a big impact on who your PSOs are going to be. Many of your PSAOs have relations already with the third-party carriers, and can get you literally hundreds of contracts with carriers. However, the big nut here is that Express Script, CVS Caremark, Prime Therapeutics, Optum. Did I miss one, Bonnie?
I believe that's it.
I think that's got it.
Yep.
Those you have to get yourself. And obviously, those names are critical and key. And in certain markets, they may be half of the scripts that you fill. And you cannot open your pharmacy until you get all those approvals. And typically, some of the larger ones may hold you up in that process.
Well, we work with many startups over the years, and obviously we've seen startups that have opened rather quickly within a few months, and then we've seen situations, unfortunately, where it take 2 to 3 years. So it's really all about planning and making sure you have the right steps in place. One of the worst things we see is when a situation in a startup where a lease is signed very early on, but the store is not ready to be open for 8 to 10 months, so that rent is being paid for all that period of time. You're burning through cash, and the insurance isn't in place as well when the store opens to fill scripts for everyone that walks through the door. So patients are having to be turned away, and the question always comes up is how many times are they going to walk away before they go somewhere else? Are they going to come back? So you want to make sure before you open the door that you are able to serve all of your customers that come in.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, we invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel.